December 1944. The night air above the pine fields of Camp Swift, Texas is cool and still. Beyond the barbed wire, searchlights sweep the dark in rhythmic silence. Inside a large wooden hall, hundreds of German prisoners sit shoulder to shoulder on rough benches, their uniforms faded, their boots dusted with red Texan soil. A faint hum fills the room, the whirring of an old film projector. Its beam cuts through a haze of cigarette smoke and settles onto a wrinkled white sheet hung against the wall. The lights dim. On screen, the opening credits of a Hollywood film flicker to life, English words most can barely read, yet every eye stays fixed, every breath held. For a brief moment, the war seems far away. The men who once fought across Africa, France, and the Ardennes watch images of laughter, love, and music. They see smiling faces instead of gunfire. They hear applause instead of artillery. The absurdity of it all, the enemy showing them joy, leaves them uneasy, almost disoriented. Yet as the reel turns, the noise of laughter grows, cautious at first, then genuine. What began as a guard's weekly duty soon became a ritual. A curious kind of truce, flickering across a white screen in the heart of wartime America. When World War II reached its height in 1943, the United States found itself facing a dilemma few could have predicted. The Allied advance through North Africa and Europe had captured tens of thousands of German soldiers. By the end of the conflict, more than 370,000 of them would be shipped across the Atlantic to prisoner-of-war camps scattered across America. It was an immense logistical and moral experiment, one that would quietly become a study in humanity amid global destruction. The first groups of prisoners arrived through the port of New York and New Orleans. They were young, sunburned from desert campaigns, many still clinging to the rigid discipline of the Wehrmacht. Their transport trains wound through the American countryside under heavy guard, windows shuttered. Most expected hostility. Nazi propaganda had painted America as a land of chaos and cruelty, where prisoners would be starved, beaten, and humiliated. But what awaited them was something else entirely. The Geneva Convention of 1929 had outlined strict rules for the treatment of POWs, and the United States, determined to demonstrate its moral strength, followed them with precision. Camps were built across 46 states, most in rural areas far from the coasts. Texas alone hosted more than 70 facilities, while others stood in Kansas, Nebraska, Georgia, and Minnesota. The prisoners labored in nearby farms, logging yards, and factories, replacing the American men who were fighting overseas. In return, they received pay credits, decent food, and quarters that often surpassed what Allied troops endured at the front. To many German soldiers, it was disorienting. The barbed wire and watchtowers confirmed their captivity, yet the guards treated them with a civility that defied the logic of war. American officers enforced hygiene, medical care, and regular inspections. There were showers, medical clinics, even libraries. Some camps held schools where German teachers, carefully vetted for Nazi ties, taught mathematics and English. Sports fields were built from open plots, and orchestras formed from whatever instruments could be scavenged. By late 1944, life inside an American POW camp bore little resemblance to the terror stories German troops had expected. Instead, they found discipline without cruelty, routine without despair. For many, this quiet civility was more unsettling than open hostility. It planted an uncomfortable thought, that the enemy might not be what Berlin had claimed. The War Department understood the power of this realization. Beneath the surface of humanitarian order lay a strategic aim: to expose German soldiers to the everyday freedoms of American life. The Office of War Information and the Psychological Warfare Division began studying how culture, rather than coercion, could transform ideology. Education programs emphasized democracy, responsibility, and the dignity of labor. But beyond textbooks and lectures, something more subtle carried that message: entertainment. Every Saturday night, if weather and schedules allowed, guards in many camps would set up projectors in recreation halls or open yards. They screened newsreels, cartoons, and feature films sent from army libraries. The titles were carefully selected, sometimes war stories, but often comedies or romances that revealed the casual ease of American society. It was an unspoken lesson in values, individual freedom, humor, and the right to dream. In some camps, the films became the week's only escape from monotony. Prisoners would polish boots and straighten collars, filling benches long before the projector clicked on. Guards often joined them, sharing benches in silence. For those 2 hours, the distance between captor and captive seemed to blur. The screen replaced the front line. Elsewhere, suspicion lingered. Hardcore Nazi officers warned their men not to be seduced by enemy propaganda. They whispered that every smile in those films was a trick, every melody a weapon. Yet for many, the images felt disarming precisely because they weren't political. Seeing ordinary Americans laughing in theaters, walking freely down city streets, or celebrating family dinners, revealed a nation very different from the caricature taught under Hitler's regime. Some German prisoners later recalled how the first film they saw, often a musical or light comedy, and left them stunned. It was not the ruthless capitalist America they had imagined, but a confident, creative society unashamed of joy. One soldier from North Africa remembered watching Casablanca and realizing for the first time that even Hollywood's vision of war carried a humanity absent in Nazi propaganda. The screenings also reflected America's self-image at the time. They were proof to the guards and local citizens that their country was fighting not only for victory, but for ideals. Many Americans living near POW camps were initially nervous about housing the enemy so close. Yet as months passed, those same civilians sold produce to the camps, hired prisoners for farm work, and even invited them to Sunday church. The screenings became a quiet reassurance. If the nation could treat its captives with fairness, it could claim a moral victory as well as a military one. Still, contradictions persisted. The camps were controlled spaces, and the hospitality came with strict boundaries. Escape attempts were rare but not unheard of. Propaganda officers among the prisoners tried to enforce loyalty, while U.S. intelligence teams quietly interrogated selected inmates for technical knowledge. But for the majority, life settled into a strange rhythm. Work by day, quiet reflection by night, and cinema on Saturdays. That pattern would continue through the final winter of the war. As Germany crumbled and Allied forces advanced toward Berlin, news trickled into the camps through censored newspapers and brief radio reports. Many prisoners struggled with guilt and disbelief. Some still clung to loyalty, while others began to sense the inevitability of defeat. Within that tension, the weekly movie screenings took on new meaning. They were no longer mere diversions. They became windows into the kind of world that might exist after the war ended. The contrast was profound. Inside those dimly lit halls, men who had once fought under the swastika found themselves laughing at American humor, admiring the music, or wiping tears during dramatic scenes. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but a transformation was beginning. And as the reels turned and the light flickered across their faces, the line between ideology and humanity began to fade, replaced by curiosity, doubt, and a quiet sense of wonder. From that atmosphere of disbelief and reluctant fascination emerged one of the most remarkable cultural experiments of World War II. A contest not of guns, but of ideas projected in silver light. The camera of history pans closer now, into the human reactions inside those walls of wire and wood. To understand what those Saturday nights truly meant, one must look from multiple angles. The Americans who arranged them, the Germans who watched, and the quiet tension of ideology meeting reality. From the American side, the screenings were never just about leisure. They were part of a deliberate, carefully crafted approach rooted in both law and psychology. The U.S. Army, guided by the Geneva Convention and a belief in moral superiority, sought to demonstrate that democracy did not fear its enemies. It educated them. Officers of the Special Projects Division and the Army Education Branch reasoned that if captured soldiers were treated with humanity, they might return home with different convictions than those they had carried under Hitler's banners. Films were the most subtle instrument in this campaign. They did not lecture or punish. They entertained. But beneath that entertainment, they carried glimpses of what America truly valued: individuality, humor, love, and self-expression. Each reel that rolled through the projector's teeth became a strand in a web of re-education, one far stronger than any speech. In Camp Clinton, Mississippi, one guard later recalled, "We didn't need to tell them what democracy was. The movies did that for us." For the German prisoners, however, the first experiences were confusing, even unnerving. Many had expected propaganda, exaggerated stories of American might or crude anti-German caricatures. Instead, they saw people singing, laughing, and falling in love. The heroes were flawed and human, not the glorified warriors of Nazi cinema. To men raised on triumph of the will and Goebbels' controlled art, the spontaneity of American film was disorienting. Some prisoners refused to attend. Hardline officers declared the screenings spiritual poison. They formed inner committees to enforce ideological purity, forbidding attendance or threatening punishment after repatriation. Yet over time, attendance grew. The power of routine and curiosity so overcame fear. Men who had once turned away began to linger near the back of the hall, pretending indifference. Eventually, they found themselves staying until the final frame. Inside the barracks, debates flourished long after the projector went silent. Some accused the Americans of manipulation. Others whispered admiration for the lives they glimpsed on screen. The freedom of women, the open humor, the unspoken equality in small gestures. For many, it was their first time seeing African American actors or women portrayed as confident individuals rather than symbols. The images challenged deeply held beliefs they hadn't questioned since boyhood. One prisoner in Texas later wrote in his journal, "We had been told Americans were soulless, but their films had more soul than all of our newsreels." Meanwhile, the guards, mostly young Americans not much older than the prisoners themselves, found common ground in the shared ritual of watching. They sat on opposite sides of the room, captor and captive, but laughed at the same jokes, gasped at the same scenes. Without speeches or translation, the movies created an invisible bridge. The films chosen were rarely political. Westerns, comedies, and romances dominated the schedules. Titles like The Philadelphia Story, Stagecoach, It Happened One Night, and Yankee Doodle Dandy traveled from camp to camp in worn metal canisters. They carried not just entertainment but fragments of America's cultural DNA: individualism, optimism, and the belief that ordinary people could rise above circumstance. In a camp near Fort Devens, Massachusetts, German officers sat through Gone with the Wind. Some reportedly scoffed at what they called emotional excess, yet others admitted to being moved by its depiction of perseverance and loss. Afterward, they argued late into the night about whether such emotional openness was a sign of weakness or strength. The question lingered: if a nation could weep openly, could it also forgive? At other camps, such as Camp McCain in Mississippi or Camp Trinidad in Colorado, the screenings became social anchors. On Saturdays, prisoners cleaned their quarters, shaved and ironed their uniforms in anticipation. The guards joked that the Germans treated movie night as if they were attending an opera. The discipline they once applied to military drills was now channeled into preserving small rituals of civility. The contrast was even sharper for officers captured from the Afrika Korps. These men had fought under Rommel, revered for his discipline and professionalism. To them, American leniency was perplexing. A few interpreted it as weakness, others as moral strength. Watching American films chipped away at those assumptions, they began to sense that victory for America was not just about firepower, but about a culture confident enough to reveal its imperfections. Beyond morale, the screenings had measurable effects. Reports from the Provost Marshal General's office noted lower escape attempts and higher cooperation among prisoners in camps with regular entertainment. Psychological analyses observed that repeated exposure to American culture, films, music, even radio plays, softened hostility and encouraged curiosity. It was indoctrination by humanity, not force. Yet the change was not uniform. Some prisoners hardened their views, interpreting American comfort as decadence. For every man enchanted by Casablanca, another scoffed at its sentimentality. Ideology dies slowly, even in the face of kindness. Still, moments of quiet transformation surfaced everywhere. At Camp Algona, Iowa, a prisoner named Karl Heinz Bohm volunteered to operate the projector after the regular technician fell ill. He learned to handle reels, splice film, and repair the fragile machines. By the end of the war, he was showing not only Hollywood features but German classics as well, an unspoken exchange between cultures. After his repatriation, Bohm became a film editor in Munich and later admitted that his first exposure to American cinema had reshaped his idea of what storytelling could be. In other camps, American officers screened newsreels alongside features. The intent was subtle but deliberate, to show real footage of the Allied advance and the devastation in Europe. For many Germans, it was their first encounter with the realities of the Eastern Front or the bombings of German cities. Some refused to believe the films, dismissing them as fabrications. Others sat in silence, their faces pale. Slowly, denial began to erode. A remarkable incident occurred in 1945 at a camp in Louisiana. After a screening of Mrs. Miniver, depicting British civilians enduring the Blitz, several prisoners requested to see it again. They said it reminded them of their own families back home. The empathy that propaganda had tried to kill resurfaced in that darkened hall, sparked by a simple story about courage and loss. By the war's end, U.S. officials noted that many POWs expressed gratitude for these moments of normalcy. They were still enemies, but they had glimpsed the humanity of their captors, and in turn their own. The Saturday screenings had evolved beyond morale or education. They had become mirrors, showing not only America's image but the prisoner's reflection within it. Every flicker of light across the screen carried the quiet suggestion that the world could be rebuilt on something more enduring than fear. The transformation, however, would reveal itself most clearly at the war's turning point, when the films no longer served to entertain the defeated, but to confront them with the moral consequences of what their nation had done. And it would happen on one unforgettable night when the laughter stopped, and the truth played out before their eyes. Spring 1945. The war in Europe was crumbling, though few inside the wire knew just how close it was to ending. Camp Shelby, Mississippi, sat beneath heavy clouds that pressed low against the pine trees. Rain pooled along the muddy paths, soaking through boots and uniforms. That night, the projector in the recreation hall whirred again. Another Saturday, another film. But the atmosphere was different. Rumors had spread among the prisoners. Hitler was dead. Berlin had fallen. Some believed it. Others refused to. For men whose entire purpose had been tied to the Reich, the silence in the hall was heavier than the storm outside. The guards chose to screen The Battle of Russia, a 1943 documentary from Frank Capra's Why We Fight series. It was not a comedy or romance this time, but an unflinching account of war's brutality. Burned villages, frozen soldiers, families in the snow. The images struck differently than the usual laughter-filled nights. Grainy footage of bombed-out cities mirrored the fears many had long denied about their own homeland. When the narrator spoke of tyranny and resistance, a few prisoners shifted uneasily. For the first time, the film did not offer escape. It forced them to confront what had been done in their name. As the projector's light flickered across faces, the hall became a mirror of guilt and revelation. Some stared blankly, their jaws clenched. Others bowed their heads. One man, a young corporal from Bremen, quietly left midway, stepping into the rain, unable to watch. He leaned against the fence, looking toward the faint lights of the American guard posts. Later, he would tell his bunkmates, "If this is true, then everything we believed was a lie." The following week brought confirmation. Newspapers delivered to the officers' quarters announced Germany's surrender. The news spread quickly through the camp, whispered across bunks like a prayer and a curse. The Reich was gone. The war was over. But for the prisoners, the emotional war had only just begun. When the next Saturday came, the Americans made a deliberate choice. Instead of war footage, they screened Yankee Doodle Dandy, a jubilant musical biography of George M. Cohan, filled with song and dance, optimism, and unabashed patriotism. It was America celebrating itself, not as a conqueror but as a nation of energy and belief. The German prisoners filed in quietly. They were no longer soldiers of a cause, merely men waiting for repatriation. At first, the bright music felt almost mocking. The tap dancing, the parades, the flags, all reminders that the war's victors could afford joy while their homeland burned. Yet as the film went on, something changed. The rhythm caught them off guard. The story was about ambition, creativity, and pride. Emotions they still understood. Some began tapping fingers against their knees in time with the music. Others, once hardened officers, smiled faintly. A U.S. sergeant in charge of the projector later wrote in his diary, "They watched like men seeing sunlight after years underground." After the screening, the hall stayed quiet for a long moment. Then unexpectedly, applause broke out. It wasn't loud or defiant, just a slow, uncertain clapping that spread from one side of the room to the other. The guards didn't stop it. They just stood by the door watching. In that fragile applause, something irreversible happened. The wall of separation between captor and captive cracked. The Germans were no longer enemies to be broken, nor Americans conquerors to be feared. For a fleeting moment, they were simply human beings sharing a story. In other camps across the country, similar scenes unfolded. The shift was almost imperceptible at first, a softening in tone and ease in conversation. Prisoners began asking for English dictionaries to understand the dialogue of the films better. Some volunteered to help repair projectors or clean the halls. In Camp Atterbury, Indiana, a group of prisoners wrote a letter to the commandant thanking him for the screenings, calling them a window to the world beyond hate. Yet not everyone embraced the transformation. Among diehard Nazis, anger brewed. They saw the laughter, the curiosity, the applause as betrayal. In one camp in Oklahoma, leaflets appeared overnight warning prisoners not to succumb to the illusions of the enemy. But the warnings had little power now. The war that had defined their loyalty was gone. Their comrades at the front were dead or captured. The flags they once saluted had been torn down. The power of cinema had done what lectures could not. It dissolved fear. In those final months, as repatriation lists were prepared and camps began to empty, the screenings continued. The films became less about propaganda and more about healing. Comedies like Arsenic and Old Lace or His Girl Friday reminded the prisoners that life could be absurd and joyful again. One evening, an American guard paused by the window of the recreation hall. Inside, the prisoners were roaring with laughter at a slapstick scene from a Charlie Chaplin reel. He watched half smiling, then wrote home to his wife. "Strangest thing I've seen. 100 Germans laughing at an American film while waiting to go home." Maybe that's victory. In later years, historians would call this cultural exposure one of the most successful psychological operations of the war, not because it reprogrammed ideology by force, but because it revealed its hollowness. When the lights came up and the laughter faded, many prisoners were left with an uneasy thought. If America could treat its enemies with such decency, what did that say about everything they had fought for? For the U.S. officers who ran these programs, the goal was never to humiliate. It was to teach by example, to demonstrate that freedom was stronger than fear, that compassion could outlast cruelty. The films were a vessel for that message, framed not in speeches but in stories. When the final reels were packed away and the projectors fell silent, many prisoners found themselves changed in ways they could not yet articulate. Some would later say that those Saturday nights, the laughter, the light, the warmth of a shared experience became the first step toward understanding the world beyond the war. It was not a victory of weapons or ideology, but of imagination. The same imagination that had built the machinery of war now found redemption in the simple act of showing a film. And in that light, cast across weary faces in a Mississippi night, the boundaries of hatred quietly dissolved. From that emotional turning point, the story would shift to its aftermath, when these men returned home to a broken Germany, carrying with them memories not of chains and cruelty, but of flickering reels and the humanity of their former enemies. The war ended. The screens dimmed. The barbed wire remained. By summer 1945, America's prisoner of war camps were full of silence, awaiting silence. The war in Europe was over, and the war in the Pacific was nearing its terrible conclusion. For the more than 370,000 German prisoners still on American soil, life had entered a strange limbo between defeat and repatriation. Some still labored in fields, harvesting crops for American farmers. Others repaired roads or worked in sawmills. But each night they returned to their barracks under the same sky, wondering what waited for them across the Atlantic. The U.S. Army faced a delicate question. What kind of men should they send back to rebuild Germany? The answer depended not only on logistics but on conscience. America had never treated its captives as mere prisoners. They had become reluctant students in a vast moral classroom.
Food, hygiene, education, and those weekend screenings were all part of that quiet mission. To reforge character through exposure,
not coercion. Reports circulated from the Provost Marshal General's office detailing remarkable results. Camps with regular cultural programs, Lectures, theater, newspapers, and film nights showed fewer disciplinary problems, fewer escape attempts, and a measurable reduction in Nazi influence. The transformation was subtle, but it was there. Officers who once refused to stand for the American anthem now helped organize camp orchestras. Men who had sneered at Hollywood films now discussed them critically in English. And everywhere, in the mess halls and sleeping quarters, conversations began to shift from pride to introspection. The screenings had played a deeper role than anyone had anticipated. They had become memories, touchstones of a world that seemed freer, more expressive, more humane. For many of the prisoners, those images of bustling cities, light-hearted laughter, and kindness under authority contrasted starkly with the life they had known under the swastika. One returning POW later wrote, "We went to America as soldiers of the Führer. We came back as men who had seen another civilization." In Germany, the first waves of returning prisoners began to arrive in late 1946. They stepped off the ships into a country barely recognizable. Cities were reduced to rubble. Streets were lined with ruins and ration queues. Many found that their families were gone, their homes destroyed. Some were greeted with suspicion, former soldiers who had survived captivity and luxury, as rumors suggested. But most carried with them a quiet conviction that what they had seen in America must somehow guide what came next. In towns like Bremen, Hamburg, and Stuttgart, returning POWs gathered in small circles to talk. They spoke not of revenge or lost battles, but of how the Americans had lived, the order, the decency, the sense of fairness even in victory. Among them were men who had once sat in the wooden halls of Texas or Louisiana, watching It's a Wonderful Life or The Grapes of Wrath. Those images, families persevering, individuals defying corruption, became templates for what Germany could be. Historians would later note how these men became early advocates for democracy in post-war West Germany. They volunteered in reconstruction programs, entered local politics, or became teachers. They encouraged debate instead of silence. It wasn't ideology that had changed them. It was exposure. The films, the routines, the acts of fairness inside those barbed wire fences had shown them a working model of humanity. Even within American military archives, reports from 1947 reflected astonishment. One memorandum from the War Department's Special Projects Division read, "The German prisoners, once indoctrinated with fascist ideals, have displayed notable adaptation to democratic values during captivity. It appears that exposure to American cultural habits, coupled with the moral example of humane treatment, has produced results more enduring than anticipated." It was perhaps the most understated summary of a quiet moral victory, but not all memories were light. Some prisoners struggled with guilt, not only for their nation's crimes, but for the comfort they had experienced while others suffered. They spoke of the dissonance between watching comedies on Saturday nights and knowing that Europe burned. One man from Dresden, captured in North Africa, later confessed, "When I saw those American films, I laughed, but part of me hated myself for it. Only after returning home did I understand that laughter was the first sign of being human again." In Germany's ruins, that rediscovered humanity became a fragile resource. It fueled cooperation with the occupying Allies and helped lay the foundation for what would become the Federal Republic. Many former POWs cited their treatment in American camps as proof that democracy could be firm, yet compassionate. Some even recreated cultural programs modeled after what they had seen. Community cinemas, adult education centers, discussion groups. The same tools that had softened ideology in captivity were now being used to rebuild civic life. Meanwhile, in America, the guards and officers who had overseen the camps reflected on their own transformation. They had entered the war to destroy an enemy, but ended it by managing one. Letters and diaries reveal that many felt an unexpected respect for the prisoners' discipline and intelligence. A former camp commandant in Nebraska wrote, "We set out to contain them, but ended up learning from them too. They showed us what happens when patriotism turns into worship. Maybe those films were meant for us as much as for them." By 1948, the last major POW camps closed. Projectors were packed away, screens dismantled, the barbed wire taken down. The temporary cities of captivity vanished almost overnight, leaving behind faint rectangles of concrete where mess halls and theaters once stood. Yet in memories, both German and American, those screenings endured as symbols of a peculiar kind of peace, one forged not through surrender but understanding. Years later, when former prisoners reunited in Germany, they often spoke of the warmth of those movie nights. They remembered the smell of tobacco smoke, the creak of wooden benches, the soft hum of the projector cutting through the dark. The films themselves blurred in memory, but the feeling remained, a sense of normalcy amid war, of shared laughter that had crossed the boundaries of language and ideology. A few even wrote to the American guards who had once watched beside them. One such letter, preserved in the archives of the U.S. Army, reads, "You gave us back something our country had taken, the ability to feel. We learned from your movies that freedom is not a weapon but a light. It is hard to quantify such a victory. There were no medals for the sergeants who ran the projectors, no monuments for the wooden halls where enemies sat side by side. But their work reached further than most battles. In those dimly lit rooms, the United States had demonstrated that compassion could be as strategic as combat, and perhaps just as powerful. By the early 1950s, as West Germany began its miraculous recovery, journalists interviewing former POWs were struck by a recurring theme. Many cited their captivity in America not as humiliation, but as awakening. They spoke of the camp libraries, the English lessons, and above all, the films. One prisoner summarized it best. Those reels were more than entertainment. They were windows into another world, one we had been told did not exist. And so, when the last ships of repatriated soldiers docked at Bremerhaven, they carried home not just memories of defeat, but of dignity, a dignity preserved by those who had every reason to deny it. That would become the quiet legacy of America's POW program, that even in war, the line between enemy and human being could blur, and sometimes under the soft light of a flickering reel, disappear entirely. The story does not end with the fences coming down. It ends in what came after, in what those men carried home, and what the world learned about victory, compassion, and the fragile power of culture. History often records wars through the roar of guns, the clash of armies, and the signatures on surrender papers. But there are quieter victories, the kind that echo longer than the battles that birthed them. Inside those American prisoner of war camps thousands of miles from the front lines, one of those victories unfolded not through force, but through humanity. The Saturday screenings, the warm meals, the steady rhythm of decency, they became something greater than acts of compliance with the Geneva Convention. They were a moral statement. America, scarred yet unbroken by war, chose to define victory not through vengeance but through restraint. Every film reel that spun under the hum of a projector became a declaration that civilization could still exist amid chaos. For the German prisoners, those images reshaped the boundaries of belief. The laughter shared during a screwball comedy, the tears shed during a tragedy, the simple act of seeing ordinary people treated with dignity, these were lessons no textbook could teach. They revealed that freedom was not an abstract slogan. It was visible in the smallest acts of kindness, in the ease with which people disagreed, created, and forgave. Many of those men would go on to rebuild their shattered homeland with that vision in mind. In post-war Germany, democracy did not sprout from speeches or occupation decrees alone. It took root in hearts that had seen compassion from their former enemies. And across the Atlantic, for the Americans who guarded them, it reinforced a conviction just as vital, that the strength of a nation lies not in how it wins wars, but in how it treats those it has already defeated. The projectors eventually went silent, the camps dismantled, the men sent home. Yet the light that filled those makeshift theaters never truly faded. It lingered, in memory, in conscience, in the fragile but enduring understanding that even in the darkest moments of human conflict, decency can prevail. In the end, the story of those screenings is not about entertainment. It is about restoration. The moment when war's enemies sat side by side and for a few fleeting hours remembered what it meant to be human.